Hey everyone, welcome to Outpost Gray, where I'm bringing you information in cybersecurity, technology, and innovation. Now, if this is your first time here to the show, thank you so much for dropping in. It would mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button below and you became part of the Outpost Gray community. For everybody else that is not new here and you're a repeat offender, thank you so much for returning. You guys are the reason that I do what I do. So I'm so thankful for your continued support. So I'm really thrilled about our guest today. I have the absolute pleasure of being able to talk to an expert in his field. And I'm going to actually be interviewing the Chief Information Security Officer for the fourth largest county in America, Lester Godsey. So Lester has over 25 years of experience working in IT and cybersecurity. I literally consider him being at the front line of defending some of our most critical assets. So I'm thrilled to be able to pick his brain today. So what are we going to be talking about? So some of my favorite topics. We're going to be talking about elections. So the 2024 elections are coming up. Get some of his insights around that. Also, there's a stigma around cybersecurity issues. Kind of get his thoughts and opinions on that. And then just talk to him about the unique challenges that he sees within the space of the state and local entities. So let's go ahead and let's bring our guest on the show. Welcome, Lester. Super excited to have you here.
Yeah, good to see you again, Jax.
I know it has been a while. We met last year at, what was that, RSAC 2022. I was hosting your room. Do you remember what your talk was about last year?
Yeah, it was, I'm trying to remember the exact title, but it was something to the effect of social media being a source of intelligence and a threat vector. And so, unfortunately, being the CISO for Maricopa County, that kind of puts us in a unique position to be authoritative in that topic.
And it's still a hot topic. Like you could still do that very same talk, I feel like today, and it would still be extremely relevant.
Yep. And unfortunately, we could have a whole new slew of examples that I didn't use the last time around for that talk as well.
What was your talk this year? Because you spoke this year. I didn't get to go to RSAC, but I know you spoke.
No, I didn't speak actually.
Oh.
So the just this recent RSA I didn't attend. Last year I spoke, and the year before that was at the tail end of COVID, so it was pre-recorded, and I was on a panel for election security with DHS and the FBI. So the
wow,
two previous RSAs I spoke at.
Yeah, so you spoke at something recently, and we were just talking about it. You were just on a panel yesterday. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so yesterday we had the Arizona Digital Government Summit, and so I was on two panels actually. So I just finished a stint of being an interim CIO until the county was able to fill that position. So one of the panels I was on was engaging with, how the vendor community can work with the government, because from a procurement perspective, working with government can be a challenge. I think based off your experience, Jax, at the federal level, you know that full well. And then the other panel I was on was with a bunch of different vendors in different spaces of technology, but it was about how government, our constituents basically want our services easy to use, effective, and secure. And so really the theme around that talk was more along the lines of, government's not the greatest when it comes to delivering services online. We don't have the same mentality as, say, like your Amazon or Google or whatever the case is. And that's how more and more people want to consume those services. So how can we do a better job of that while still maintaining security and delivering those critical services?
That's a really good discussion. Is that recorded? Is there any way to get access to that? I can share it with the episode.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that. I don't believe that those sessions were recorded, unfortunately, but maybe that's a future topic for us. We'll see.
Yeah. And everybody, so you can follow Lester on LinkedIn. His information will be down below, so make sure you follow him, reach out to him on LinkedIn. So as I mentioned in your intro, you are the CISO for the fourth largest county in the United States. That's a big deal. I mean, that is no small feat to be able to manage all of that, especially with how the elections, how challenging it can be during the election time. Can you share with us some of the most significant challenges that you've observed in the state and local cybersecurity landscape, as well as some of the biggest threats that you've seen targeting the state and local government?
Sure. You know, so there's kind of two aspects of that. One is the typical kind of stuff that regardless of what sector you're in, you're going to see, right? And so
Mhm.
you're going to see your passive active networking scans. You're going to see attempts to drop web shells into your, public facing web applications and et cetera, malware, ransomware, et cetera. And I don't mean to sound cavalier about that, but
Mhm.
everybody, experiences that. I think specifically for state and local government, really one of the biggest challenges that across the board. So when I talk to my counterparts across the United States, it's really a combination of things. So one, a couple of years ago, you've noticed this, I'm sure, where governments in particular were being targeted for ransomware. And so one of the prevailing theories with respect to that was government traditionally, in comparison to other sectors, does a poor job of cybersecurity in general. So easy target for ransomware attacks.
Mhm.
The threat actors also knew that most governments had cybersecurity insurance, and so our ability to pay was significantly higher than, say, other sectors, and so that made us a target. So we saw a lot of that. But I would say, at least from my experience in Maricopa County, probably the biggest impact and things that we're having to deal with directly and indirectly is that trust in government is at an all-time low. And
Mm.
and so as a result, what we're seeing is more and more not only cyber incidents and attacks, but also kinetic or physical threats against local government. And so, and an example of that is after the 2020 election, just across the nation, not just Maricopa County, we saw such an increase in threats against elected officials and election staff
Right.
that the White House, or the DOJ at the behest of the White House, created a task force in conjunction with the FBI to try to address those things. So I personally was involved in talking to our local FBI office, as well as our recorder who's responsible for elections in Maricopa County, and a couple of other folks about what are we experiencing, how to report those sort of things, et cetera, et cetera. So, we're really at a kind of uncharted territory with regards to threats. And by extension, I think one of the more interesting things is what my security team, especially my ops team, has had to deal with like a couple of years ago versus now is completely different.
Hmm.
Just the nature of our service, what we're seeing, and kind of really an increased blurring of lines between cyber and kinetic risk. So,
That is really interesting. And I wasn't really considering that kinetic piece, but you're right. There were a lot of officials that were being attacked during the 2022 election. And that was the first time I had noticed so many physical attacks. Did you see as many before that? I think it really took a peak in 2022, though, for physical
yeah.
attacks.
And so, and just to be clear, at least from our perspective, we didn't have anybody who was actually physically injured, but we saw a lot of physical threat leading up to and post 2020 election.
Hmm.
So, and I think I might have used this as an example in the RSA that you and I had initially met, but it was after the 2020 election. And so one of the things that my ops team does and has been doing for years now is actively monitoring social media for indications of potential threat, either cyber and or kinetic, right? And so we caught wind of somebody who was actually staking out our recorders building, or one of the buildings, noticed that a truck was being loaded up with equipment, which they falsely identified as voting equipment. So they thought that this equipment was being loaded in the back of a truck, that we were getting rid of evidence. And so,
Wow.
so they started posting this, and then immediately people were like, oh, you need to follow that vehicle. So they started live streaming it, and was actually following the vehicle. What they were following was a sheriff's deputy, because it was in the building was shared between the sheriff's office and the recorders. So they falsely identified it as, number one, a recorder asset. It wasn't. It was a sheriff who was loading it up with an old multifunction device that needed to be salvaged. And so that was a situation where, so we were seeing this in real time. And so we were able to notify appropriate folks about that. But depending on how that turned out, that could have turned out pretty bad. And so that's just one of, unfortunately, many examples that we saw. Like 2022, we saw somebody, we saw evidence of somebody cutting a chain link fence to try to get access into the space where the recorder is located. We've caught people dumpster diving, looking for quote unquote evidence. And so, it's really a fine line. One thing that I would say, Jax, that as a government organization, we exist, among other things, to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. I believe we even signed something to that effect when we gain employment with the county. So we want to be respectful of everybody's right for peaceful protest. But at the same time, there's been multiple situations where the potential risk for physical harm is so heightened that we have to be cognizant of that and ensure that we take the appropriate steps from an awareness notification perspective. So that's really, we've just seen it. To your point, we've seen a lot of that escalate in 2022, but we definitely saw a lot that beginning in the 2020 election cycle.
Yeah, and elections, it's a big topic. And it's like, I haven't seen it really in the news as of yet, but we all know we're going to start having an uptick of conversations around election fraud, just waiting for that word to go out, especially for the presidential elections coming up in 2024. And the state and local entities like yourself, you guys have a big lift during that time when the elections are coming up. And there is obviously an increased concern for the state and local entities. Can you share with us any notable tactics, techniques, and procedures that you observed from the 2020 elections compared to 2022? And then maybe any projections that you have for the presidential elections?
Sure. So that question is really salient in that we saw a significant shift between the TTPs from the 2020 election versus 2022. I have theories. Obviously, I'm not the federal government. I don't have the resources to be able to say that definitively. But in 2020, we basically saw every type of cybersecurity attack that is part of the playbook, if you will. So literally, no exaggeration, we saw passive active network scans to try to, access our perimeter. We saw attempts to, gain control over public facing assets. We saw data scraping attacks. We saw multiple DDoS attacks based off of our partnership with state and federal government agencies, because we don't do attribution. That's not our role, nor do we have the intelligence to do that. But based off of feedback we receive from the federal government, we saw evidence of advanced persistent threat actors, APT groups, nation state attacks, obviously hacktivists, and as well as probably the biggest impact, mis, dis, and malinformation attacks. In 2022, we didn't see, to our knowledge, so we didn't see any active or persistent attacks of a more cyber nature. The vast majority of what we saw was mis, dis, and malinformation, as well as kinetic events. And so, so we saw an inordinate increase along those lines. But some of the kinetic events we saw was, for example, it was in the news across the country where we had folks in tactical gear with automatic weapons staking out ballot drop box locations, right? And so yeah, so that's the kind of stuff that we saw in 2022. So, my theory, again, just one person's opinion,
Right.
but my theory as to why we saw a shift in TTPs is path of least resistance, meaning depending on what what your goal or objective is, you're going to take the path of least resistance to get to the end state that you desire, right? So if your objective is to interject doubt and fear in the process, in this case the election voting process, then why go through the process of expending the time and resources finding skilled labor, frankly, to be able to do DDoS attacks or more sophisticated cyber attacks?
Right.
Just leverage the platform that's freely available for all intents and purposes, and stir the pot that way. um, so that's my theory as to why that's occurred the way it has, or it's developed. Now, with the presidential election coming on board, I forecast we'll see more of a mix, kind of like what we did in the 2020 election. I do think that social media will still be, by and large, the biggest weapon for our adversaries, including nation states and APT groups. But I do think we'll also see more cyber activities. One net new thing I will say that I'm expecting, I'm hoping I'm wrong, but I do think we'll see evidence of deep fake video technology used against us. And the reason why I say that is because post 2020 election, we had to address still images that were doctored to meet a narrative. And so in my mind, that's the logical extension to that type of tactic is the deep fake videos. So
that is valid. Yeah, it's a little scary. I agree, though, that why change what works? And if the social media platforms are what works, then adversaries, it's a business. They're going to go after the low hanging fruit. That doesn't cost them a lot of money and resources. They have SOC accounts, shell accounts, whatever you want to call them. That and I think we even chatted about this, how some of them like go into hibernation, aren't used during a period of time, and then suddenly they start getting populated with content to get their algorithms back up right before they start utilizing them in malicious ways for these campaigns that come up. So it's low hanging fruit, doesn't take a lot of resources. They're not having to create a 0-day and do persistence within a network and find a vulnerability and do all these things. It's just, yeah, let's sow discord within the citizens and show that the government is not for them and against them and the system's broke. I mean, it's really that easy. So
yeah, absolutely.
So with that, pivoting a little bit, but still on that kind of topic, I know that we chatted before this interview, and I talked to you about, I just did a paper, I just graduated with my master's and did my capstone on active cyber defense and hacking back because of the most recent national cybersecurity strategy that came out. And I was really interested on kind of how we were going to approach the future of cybersecurity and really secure a national or secure our nation and our critical infrastructure. And something I noticed is that a lot of organizations that could use active cyber defense steer away from it for just, risk adverse from various different reasons. But when you and I talked, you actually talked about that Maricopa County actually uses active cyber defense techniques within your environment. And if you could, can you talk about what those defense techniques look like and how you're utilizing them within your environment to secure the elections?
Sure, absolutely. Obviously, I can't disclose too much from the
Correct.
playbook,
Right.
but and before I jump in, just to be clear, so we don't hack back. That's just not something we do. Uh, Even if we had the capabilities, I mean, to a certain degree, we have the skill set. We would never do that. Uh, and I'm sure your paper is a better source of this than my conversation, but um, you don't really know whether or not you're hacking back at the root cause of the attack in the first place, and you don't want to start an international event as well too. So there's just a lot of reasons why you don't do that. But to your point, we do take a more active role along those lines. And honestly, Jax, when I started 3.5 years ago in Maricopa County, um, these sort of things weren't high on my priority for our portfolio of services. And unfortunately, we've had to respond to active threats. And that's why we're looking at active defense mechanisms in place. And specifically, what caused us to do that was our monitoring of social media and observing that this was in relation to the 2022 election cycle. So most organizations, Maricopa County included, when it comes to elections, it's a very seasonal process. And so at the height of elections, we depend on a lot of part-time, temporary staff and or volunteers. And so the recorders put out their call for volunteers. And what we were seeing on social media were multiple calls to have people, basically, they didn't use these words, but infiltrate the organization to have an insider view on what was going on and to keep tabs or make sure we were doing the right thing. Again, and so to be clear, our recorder's office actually has and continues to hold multiple tours of our facility to explain the process. We've done that with press. We've done that with the public. We continue to do that. We encourage, actually, our recorder had to encourage people who were doubtful of the process to volunteer and see firsthand. But at the same time, we were seeing on social media that their intention wasn't to educate themselves in an objective manner. Their intent was to try to infiltrate and possibly throw a monkey wrench into the process. And so, So as a result of all that, we had to take steps to take a more active approach along those lines. So we've deployed deception networking technology along those lines. Not only, from a honey mine, honey pot type of thing, but also anomalous behavior, from a network perspective. And also our incident response operations protocols reflect an awareness of insider threat along those lines. So much so to the point where in preparation for the 2022 election cycle, it wasn't just technical controls that we deployed. We also developed a practice tabletop exercise specifically around insider threat. And so, because our thought process was, if somebody is persistent enough, it doesn't matter how good at controls you have. So we wanted to have those defensive controls in place in a more proactive manner, to your point. But we've practiced what our response and how we would address that would look like as well. So it's really unfortunate, but we have to respond to credible threat and heightened risk to the organization, regardless what it looks like. And so we're fortunate that we've had the resources, that we've had the support from management, from our recorder's office, from our county manager, board of supervisors, and they're all aware and participatory in that because they know what the risk is to the organization.
Yeah, and that's very uncommon to have that collective support within organizations, and we'll chat about this too. A couple of more questions down about how Maricopa County does have more resources compared to maybe a smaller state and local entity, and it really sounded like you guys had gotten forced in a way, you got pushed into a corner where this was the best approach to help defend the network, was taking a more active approach. And I like how you clarified the hacking back, because something I found out during my research is hacking back and active cyber defense are actually completely different. However, in the community prior to doing this paper, they're like clumped together as one and the same, but they're actually extremely different. One is illegal in many terms, being that hacking back portion. And then there is a gray area in staying out of the having legal prosecution based on the CFAA, basically in Section 1030. So we could go into a whole conversation and nerd out on that, but we won't do that. I'm going to pivot because I want to talk about a recent activity by the federal government and a program that they created, and I'd love to get your insights around it. So a couple of years ago, the federal government created a program that was called the State and Local Cybersecurity Grant Program that provided $1 billion in funding, and which seems like a ton, but we're looking at like across the board for state and local. And the funding was for eligible entities to address cybersecurity risk and cybersecurity threats to information systems owned or operated on the behalf of state and local or tribal governments. And so, from your perspective, 1 billion seems like that's a lot of money. But do you believe that was enough funding? And how is it being received by the state and local government and security leaders like yourself?
Yeah. So, I think that specific program, the $1 billion, I think the dollar amount's great. Um, and to be fair, in Maricopa County's case, there was funding prior to that that we were able to leverage too. So CARES Act funding, that sort of thing. So in particular, I was able to take advantage of that. The program that you're specifically referencing, the way that money was disseminated, it was down to the states who then had a responsibility at that state level to then further disseminate that down to the locals and the tribes, that sort of thing. And so I think the dollar amount is fantastic. That particular program, there were some caveats. So it was over a 4-year period. There was a certain uh, in-kind requirement that you had to, chip in for, if you will. So it wasn't completely quote unquote free money. And so especially smaller organizations had to be cognizant about if they were going to take that funding, that what was their required contribution in year 1 versus year 4. And I believe it scaled up. So, but nonetheless, I think that was a great program. I think the dollar amount certainly is not enough, especially when you look at the way you phrased it, that $1 billion was for all 50 states, in the United States. So when you kind of filter it down, and then considering how many, counties there are, in Arizona has large counties. So I think there's only 15 counties in Arizona versus some East Coast states have hundreds, or states in the South have hundreds of counties. And then you have your towns and your cities, and then the tribes, obviously, too. So really, when you look at it that way, it kind of obviously it's better than nothing, but it's not enough. But I would also say, you know, tools and services are one thing, but and I'm sure you've talked about this and you've seen this firsthand, but part of the issue too is, even if you had enough money, do you have the resources and expertise to deploy that, and to deploy it in a way that makes sense to your organization? Meaning, um, it's all well and good, but do you have the right know-how in order to effectively implement it? Or, I've seen unfortunately so many instances where you have all the tools, but you just don't have them deployed in a way that makes sense or that is effective. And so there's so many problems, and there's such a shortage even today, unfortunately, with skilled cybersecurity professionals, that is also part of the problem, if you will. So money will only go so far along those lines.
So what it sounds like is that this grant money is like, it's a good initial start, and it does provide some real opportunities for these entities that have received it to really establish a cybersecurity program within their environment. Because I think one of the things I saw is, I dug into it a while back, but I was looking through it really quick here, and I think one of the um, requirements for them was to establish a cybersecurity planning committee. And
Hmm.
so, that, going back to what you just said about having the appropriate resources and tools and teams, like, you're giving this money to an organization that a lot of times may not have anything really established, and now you're requiring them to establish a committee and get all of these things developed within their environment, but they don't have the right tools, the resources, and talent. So do you feel that maybe there needs to be a more hands-on approach from the government to help these entities establish these programs, or maybe there should be additional funding sources to be leveraged to maybe help with that talent gap, or the tools and the resources?
I definitely think that would definitely be an option and a way to address the problem. Um, you know, and so again, you kind of alluded to that, to this earlier. Maricopa County is in a very fortunate position, especially in comparison to other government agencies, especially local government. I have a pretty robust staff, a very skilled staff along those lines. I think especially smaller organizations, need all the help they can get. So whether that's in the form of, I think the state governments have a bigger role that they can play. I do know, for example, in North Dakota, they function more like the state security group functions more like a service provider for all the local governments and K through 12. K through 12 traditionally are the most challenged with
Mm.
regards to cybersecurity. Um, I also know in Texas, Nancy, the CISO over there, she has an initiative underway with the local universities to provide SOC type services across the state of Texas. And so I think there are things that government agencies are doing, but they tend to be more at the state level because given the nature of their scope of responsibility, it makes more sense along those lines, right?
Yeah.
And so I think help along those lines is definitely is warranted. But whether it's coming from the state agencies or valued, third party providers to provide that initial level of security and awareness, no, I think it's more. It just the cat needs to get skin, and by who, and if it's a state or federal, great. If not, but it doesn't change the fact it still needs to be addressed. So
Agree. Yeah, 100% agree with that. So I have a couple follow-ups on some things you said. So it's a two-part question. So I'll try to present it so it won't confuse you. So as you stated, you're in a really fortunate spot because Maricopa County does have a robust cybersecurity program. You have a robust team in place. And so from your perspective, and if you were, let's just say you're talking to a group of smaller counties, how would you suggest to the smaller counties a way for them to secure funding to enhance their own cybersecurity risk management programs? And then the second part to that question is, do you have any suggestions on how they could prioritize their cybersecurity investments with that limited budget to ensure they have the most effective protection for their state and local entities?
yeah. So in terms of the first question, the funding. So to your point, if I were, and I used to work in very small organizations as well, and so I wore multiple hats. Um, Definitely programs like the federal this latest round of federal funding, I would definitely take advantage of. You have to obviously make sure that your organization is aware of the in-kind requirements, those sort of things. But I would definitely take advantage of those, and I would prioritize what those procurements are based off of where the gaps are within that organization. There's additional sources of funding along those lines too. So, um, so I'm on a subcommittee. I'm a co-chair for one of the subcommittees for UASI, the Urban Area Security Initiative, which was predominantly public safety, so fire and PD. A couple years back, because cyber became such a thing for that group, that they created a subcommittee specifically around cybersecurity. And so a big part of what I'm responsible for in the Phoenix UASI area is allocation of federal funding towards cybersecurity centric activities, right? So there are multiple sources of funding out there. Some require in-kind, some no obligation for any sort of matching or anything of that sort. So there are multiple funding sources if you know where to look, right? So, but those are some of the things I would encourage smaller organizations to try to take advantage of. And to your second part of the question, what I would strongly recommend is, and if the organization doesn't have the expertise to do this in house, bring in a partner that you trust to do an assessment of your organization from a cyber risk perspective. And really, because at the end of the day, smaller organizations have limited resources, whether it's actual funding for tools, services, controls, or personnel, or ability to hire skilled staff in the cyber field. And I would and I would assess and be realistic about where the biggest threat to the organization is and go after that. And I would also go so far as to suggest that a lot of the issues that large organizations like my own, as well as small ones, aren't really gated by technology, but they're more process and workflow. And so what I mean by that is I'll use a current example. So just about a year ago, I was involved in updating the county's terms and conditions for a new procurement of software and services, right? So unfortunately, the old T's and C's were around for over a decade. So it was making reference to stuff that's not even relevant anymore in this day and age. And so, but that's something that costs $0 for any organization that moving forward, a small organization that's evaluating new software, put in your T's and C's. Hey, if it's a hosted, provider, make sure that they provide a SOC 2 report and not Amazon's or Microsoft SOC 2, because that doesn't do you any good, right? So put in comments about sharing, requiring vendors to do some basic security assessment, or at least adhere to your security standards that you may or may not have. Hopefully you do, right? And so you can do some basic things to reduce risk before that risk is even brought into your organization, right? And so, or things like, if you have the ability to do vulnerability scans, share the results of those scans with departments, and have that workflow in place to have accountability, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of things that organizations can do, but if you don't have that starting point and know where your risk pain points are, then you can't intelligently. Doesn't matter how much money you have, you're not going to be able to effectively identify where your biggest bang for your buck is going to be in terms of implementation of security controls and services to reduce that cyber risk for your organization.
100%. And that actually is a great segue into one of the questions I wanted to talk about was enterprise risk management. We chatted about this briefly, and it's still a very foreign topic, a lot of unknowns. It's actually, we should do an RSA talk about this together. We should do that. Let's do it. Anyway, we'll follow up on that because I really want to speak at RSAC. So anyway, so enterprise risk management is very unfamiliar territory for many state and local entities. And so I want to get your perspective on why you think there is a lack of understanding in this area and how we can promote that adoption. And I want to add one more thing for the listeners too. When we're talking about enterprise risk management, we're looking at risk at a holistic enterprise approach. And it also, part of that ERM is looking at the risk, creating a risk profile for the client and understanding what is the risk tolerance, what is the risk appetite. And we're really, it's not an area that's really explored right now. So anyway, you're just getting your opinions on how we could promote this and adoption into the space.
Yeah, and I think to your initial question, I don't think so. Just speaking for CISOs, I don't think we holistically have done a good enough job in explaining how, whether it's cybersecurity risk management or true enterprise risk management, can help organizations make better business decisions, period. And so I think traditionally, cybersecurity has more of the, sexy factor as opposed to like enterprise risk management, where when people think about risk management at that level, they're thinking like, oh, okay, what insurance coverages do we have for collisions or accidents or whatever? It doesn't have the same panache as, like, say, cybersecurity, just based off of those sort of things don't make the news, unlike cybersecurity, right? And so I don't think there's an appreciation especially at the local and state level along those lines, and I'm not advocating that risk management should be the only criteria by which an organization makes business decisions, but I am advocating that it should be a factor along those lines. So at least within my cybersecurity program, even, we have a weighted scorecard model that we use, which is a factor of risk. So traditional definition of risk, but also cost to the organization, because we're very budget conscious, and benefit to the organization, so alignment to strategic goals and initiatives. And so we try to make decisions based off of our portfolio, based off of that. But so to your bigger question about enterprise risk management, this is something that our board of supervisors, with their update to their county strategic plan, has specifically called out. They want a program established for enterprise risk management, which I think is so forward thinking, especially at local government level. And so I've been working with our internal audit department and risk management department. I don't think cyber should be leading that. That's not our place. We don't define true enterprise risk management. But I think we're one leg of a three-legged stool in the case of Maricopa County, where cyber definitely should be providing input, what we're seeing, what we believe the cyber risk is to the organization. But one thing I want to add, you hit it just straight off, with an enterprise risk management, a mature enterprise risk management program in place, especially at government, one of the things that that organization should then be able to do is articulate in definitive ways what their risk tolerance is and what their risk threshold is, right? And so being able to do that really makes everything better, makes business process or business decision making better, incident response, right? And so one of the things I've wanted to do, fingers crossed, is to do a tabletop exercise around ransomware. And not to get too controversial, I know a lot of people are like, hey, organizations should never pay ransom. We've seen legislation in some parts of the US where they're like, paying the ransom is illegal, right? And that's a dangerous position to be in, to have such a black and white, that's my opinion, position. And so what if your organization happens to have a nuclear reactor within its boundaries, and that facility was compromised, but it's illegal to pay the ransom? But what's the potential risk as a result, right?
Yeah.
So
killing, like losing lives, right? Where's the
100%.
balance?
So enterprise risk management helps an organization articulate what their tolerances are along those lines. And so there's so much value in that. So I think that topic's fascinating, especially from a government perspective, where especially local government, we tend to be very immature.
Yeah, I love it. Oh, love that insight. Could keep on talking about it, but I know we're about out of time. And I have one more question before wrapping up I want to ask you. So it's kind of a fun question. If you will think about like having a big wand and you could, provide insight to a state and local entity, what strategy or best practice would you recommend for a state and local entity to implement first among anything else within their environment to help them foster cybersecurity awareness and develop really that culture among their employees? Just one thing.
Yeah. Wow. That's a great question. And so it's an interesting one in that, and I'm sure a lot of my counterparts are not going to be thrilled by this, but I would say, if you have the CISO hat, or if you're responsible for your cyber program, you're going to have to add another tool to your tool belt, which is marketing, honestly. And so, I was having this conversation with my operations director, because not to make this about me, but so as I shared with you offline, I'm reaching the end of my public service, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do when I grow up for my next career. And so one of the things I was talking to him about was, I don't think I want to go into sales, because I don't have any experience in that. I don't think I would be good at it. And he looked at me and he's like, who are you kidding? You're selling every day, in your current job. And I thought about it and I'm like, man, he is right. And so one of the things that we do in Maricopa County that I think has really helped change that culture, and you probably have heard marketing, or spiels where everybody's part of security, right?
Yes.
And so I definitely believe that, but how do you drive that home? And so we've taken not just a top-down approach, but bottom-up and everything in between. And so between my quarterly governance steering committee meetings with C-level leaders throughout Maricopa County, we have a security champions cadre program that's made up of line staff representing a good percentage of the departments in Maricopa County to help more of a grassroots approach, your standard newsletters and things of that sort, right? So that's all stuff that we do. We do contests, we do giveaways, and which is all well and good. But we also, something that's unique is we do daily intelligence briefings as well. We send that out to all the C-level folks within those departments that participate in our governance. And so I have agreement with them that those daily briefs will also highlight security incidents and attacks, and we'll share who that occurred with. So we all have an awareness. And then I aggregate that, or my team aggregates that, and then sends an anonymized version that's of a weekly one that's sent to county management and a wider audience. And so that really, A, it's great from an intelligence perspective, but B, it really gives the organization a sense of scope and scale of the problem at hand, if you will. And it makes them aware that, oh, holy cow, this is why we go through our annual required security training, because this is the kind of stuff that they're dealing with. And so another example of unusual things is my ops team, they do monthly virtual warfare range activities to practice incident response and et cetera, et cetera. But we invited our security champions, who are non-technical folks, to observe that table or that exercise in the warfare range. And so they were commenting, providing feedback in the background as they were observing how we address security events. And so it was very eye-opening for them to be able to see, oh, wow. And I was providing commentary in the background saying, this is not speculative. This is stuff that we see all the time that we're just trying to hone our response to, right? And so and so it's really incredible, the marketing. And if you add that to your responsibility and you take that approach of not only for information sharing, but to give the organization awareness of what the threat is to the organization, that really kind of shifts everybody's heads. Where I've seen it where they're like, instead of InfoSec being a pain in the butt and making me do X, Y, and Z, they understand why we're doing X, Y, and Z, because they have the bigger picture in mind along those lines. And so I'm not even describing all the stuff that we do along those lines. Cybersecurity Awareness Month, we do lunch and learns, but our most popular one always is we'll bring in a third party who provides us threat intelligence and assessments. And he or she will present to whoever is interested in the topic, what have we seen at Maricopa County over the last year in terms of threats, nation states, email phishing, business email compromise, credential harvesting, et cetera, et cetera. And people are just they're so enlightened of what's going on. And I think there's a certain appreciation for what we're doing as a result. So that's really, in my opinion, heads and shoulders what's helped drive the change in culture.
Yeah. Cybersecurity awareness culture and bringing it, making it, like you said, because even in the military, they're like, security is everyone's job, but who really owns it? It's ownership. And I think marketing and communication and getting individuals engaged and involved. And I love that. That was of course, great answer. So Lester, I think we're at time now, but we could definitely continue talking. You're brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on the Outpost Gray show and just sharing your amazing insights with the community.
No, thank you for the opportunity. It was fun to chat, and congrats on your graduation again. That was awesome.
Thank you. Bye.